Imagine, if you will, the moment her mother realized what she might have done. A gesture of protection, a remedy whispered by healers, transformed into the cruelest of fates. A mother's hand, trembling as it measured powders and stirred tinctures, unknowingly set the clock ticking on her daughter's final days. A gift meant to ensure a grandson for the Russian throne instead rang the empire's funeral bell. Before we peel back the layers of this disaster, pause and consider the horror of that night. What should have been filled with joy and the promise of new beginnings ended in despair and terror. If this revelation unsettles you, let it be a reminder that behind every crown lies the shadow of ruin, and behind every palace wall lurk secrets more dangerous than armies. The year was 1571. Across the breadth of Russia, Ivan IV's dreaded regime, the Oprichnina, ruled with fear. His network of secret police, his punitive raids, and his calculated spectacles of violence kept the land in a grip of terror. Ivan, then 41 years old, longed for stability through dynastic continuity. His second wife, Maria Temrukovna, had died under suspicious circumstances only 2 years earlier, leaving him without a robust male heir. Desperate to secure his bloodline, Ivan launched what chroniclers would later call the largest bridal contest Muscovy had ever seen. From the frozen forests near the White Sea to the windswept plains beyond the Volga, envoys gathered more than 2,000 maidens, each brought to the fortress of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, a citadel 100 kilometers from Moscow. The fortress was no ordinary palace. It was also the stronghold of Ivan's feared oprichniki, his dreaded bodyguards whose brutality had earned them infamy. For the young women arriving there, the atmosphere must have been chilling. Within those walls, executions were as common as daily bread, a grim reminder that the Tsar's favor could be as lethal as his anger. The selection process followed strict Byzantine traditions passed down from Constantinople. Every candidate was inspected with near-scientific precision. Physicians examined their bodies for purity, fertility, and robust health. Astrologers charted the stars, seeking signs of harmony or doom between maiden and monarch. The competition narrowed swiftly, from 2,000 hopefuls to just 24, then to 12 finalists. Foreign envoys stationed in Russia reported home with unease. Venetian dispatches, carefully coded to avoid interception, described a ruler oscillating between religious gloom and unpredictable fury. To them, this was no mere matter of marriage. It was a question that could alter the balance of power between East and West. A stable union might calm Ivan's rages and secure succession. A misstep, however, could plunge Muscovy deeper into chaos. On the 26th of June, 1571, the decision was declared. Marfa Vasilyevna Sobakina, daughter of a wealthy Novgorod merchant, emerged victorious. Contemporary accounts describe her as gentle, yet composed, a figure who blended innocence with intelligence, an ideal consort for a ruler in need of solace. Yet even as her triumph was announced, ominous whispers began to stir. Within days, attendants noticed Marfa appearing pale and frail, her strength ebbing though her wedding preparations had only just begun. The palace physicians failed to diagnose her illness. Their prayers and herbal remedies proved useless. Some blamed exhaustion from the endless ceremonies. Others whispered of sorcery, of jealous rivals seeking her downfall. A young woman, barely 19 years old, walked toward what later chroniclers would describe as the most fateful and dangerous altar in all of Russian history. The air inside the chapel was thick with incense, yet behind the fragrance lingered the heavy weight of dread. She carried within her body, though she could not have known it, a poison, a silent enemy that rumor would later insist would claim her life within just 15 days. Marfa Sobakina, as history remembers her, could not have foreseen that the very night meant to seal her triumph and her future as Tsarina of Russia would instead mark the beginning of her end. What was expected to be a sacred night of consummation, a moment when the empire's dynastic hopes would be secured, became instead a death sentence. All of this, whispers claimed, was set in motion by a mother's desperate act of love, a simple draft meant to strengthen fertility, a potion that fatefully turned into lethal poison. The halls of Moscow soon echoed with gossip. What should have been an imperial celebration transformed into a tale of horror that would ripple through the annals of time. Court rumors whispered of hidden powders and tinctures, of quiet weapons slipped behind curtains and beneath goblets. They spoke of supposed cures that doubled as silent assassins, able to heal, but also capable of destroying without leaving a trace. Ivan IV, remembered by history as Ivan the Terrible, was no stranger to suspicion. When his third bride withered in his arms, he believed her death to be no accident. To him, it was murder disguised as medicine, betrayal cloaked in the form of motherly affection. In his fury, he turned the court upside down, convinced that dark hands had struck at the very heart of his household. Within weeks, the bodies began to fall. Reports claimed that nearly 20 lives were cut short, each victim paying the price for what he even saw as an unforgivable crime. One nobleman, it was said, was dragged into Red Square, where his execution played out before a hushed and horrified crowd. Chroniclers described the scene as one of stunned silence, where the people of Moscow watched with wide eyes, afraid to breathe as blood was spilled at the Tsar's command. Whether every detail was true or embroidered with time, one fact remained undeniable. The sudden, tragic death of the young Tsarina fueled Ivan's paranoia to terrifying new heights. Letters preserved in secret archives, diplomatic notes exchanged in hushed codes, and chronicles written years later all painted the same haunting picture. Marfa Sobakina's death was not simply a personal tragedy, it was a turning point. It pushed a ruler already feared for his merciless justice deeper into a realm of suspicion and dread. Historians today look back on the 16th century and see the hand of mercury, a substance prized in those years as both a cure for venereal disease and a supposed aid to conception. It may have been this very element, respected as medicine but feared for its hidden dangers, that became the silent killer in Marfa's tale. What was believed to bring life may have instead delivered death. And so, the bridal chamber of 1571 became something far darker than a place of union. It was remembered as both the scene of a young bride's demise and the birthplace of an emperor's deepest paranoia. Chroniclers would later write that in those shadowed rooms, Russia itself took a step into an age of fear. In just 15 days, treachery, anguish, and consequence unfolded with more intensity than decades of open war. This was not a story that physicians wished to remember. It was not a tale the imperial court wanted told. It was buried, hidden beneath records for centuries, its full truth clouded by rumor, legend, and fragments of testimony. But then buried secrets leave echoes, and the echo of Marfa Sobakina's tragedy has reached across more than 400 years to haunt history. Later generations would speculate that the true cause lay closer to home. They suggested that Marfa's own mother, desperate to secure her daughter's fertility, had prepared a potion laced with mercury. At the time, mercury was believed to quicken conception, but in excess, it ravaged the body from within. Whether this story was truth or legend, it became embedded in history, giving Marfa Sobakina a place not just as a bride of Russia, but as the tragic heroine of one of its darkest mysteries. Her brief journey, from selection to sickness, remains one of the court's most unsettling enigmas, and it was only the beginning. At 19 years old, Marfa Sobakina embodied a radiance that many in Moscow's court described as almost ethereal. Chroniclers compared her hair to molten gold, shimmering under torchlight, and her eyes to the deep, unbroken calm of northern lakes. Her beauty was not her only strength. She was admired for her quiet intelligence and gentleness, traits that seemed to offer a fragile promise of stability to an empire that had grown restless under Ivan's turbulent rule. The physicians who examined her during the selection were unanimous in their assessments. She was strong, healthy, and, most importantly to Ivan, capable of bearing heirs. To the Tsar, she was more than just another bride. She was hope incarnate, the last possibility of anchoring his dynasty with a legitimate successor. Her father, Vasily Sobakin, was no ordinary merchant. His fortune placed him among the rising wealthy classes of Novgorod, men whose riches and influence rivaled the old nobility. Family connections, distant ties to Maluta Skuratov, Ivan's dreaded lieutenant of the Oprichniki, helped secure Marfa's place among the chosen candidates. For some observers, her selection was more than just a personal triumph. It symbolized a shift in Russia itself. Merchants and men of enterprise were pressing against the barriers of hereditary privilege, their daughters standing side by side with the daughters of boyars. To Ivan Vasilievich, the stakes could not have been higher. At 41, he had already buried 2 wives and 2 sons, each loss wrapped in clouds of suspicion. His tall, imposing frame, said to nearly touch 2 meters, cast a commanding presence. Yet inside that frame dwelled storms of insecurity, superstition, and a rage that terrified even his closest confidants. Ivan had built his rule on fear, staging executions as public theatre, a macabre reminder to nobles and commoners alike that he held absolute dominion over life and death. The death of his second wife had cut deep into his already unstable soul. Without a male heir strong enough to inherit the throne, Ivan's dynasty stood on a precipice. To him, Marfa was not merely a beautiful bride, she was the last gamble, the final chance to secure Russia's future. Preparations for the wedding unfolded with imperial grandeur. Embroidered gowns were stitched with pearls and gemstones. Golden crowns, heavy with meaning, were prepared for the couple. The Trinity Church at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, with its onion domes reaching into the sky, was chosen as the sacred stage. Foreign envoys noted the ceremony with fascination, reporting every detail to their homelands, for Ivan's union could shift the balance of Europe itself. But beneath this glittering surface, shadows gathered. In Novgorod, Marfa's mother wrestled with her anxieties. She feared her daughter's delicate health, feared the pressure that would fall on her once she entered the Tsar's bedchamber. In her desperation, she turned to an old household remedy, whispered through generations of healers and midwives. It was meant to ensure fertility, to guarantee that the new Tsarina would conceive swiftly and secure her place at court. The first days after the wedding passed in a haze of unease. Marfa Sobakina, now Tsarina of all Russia, never recovered the glow expected of a royal bride. Instead of radiance, she carried the pallor of the grave. Her body weakened quickly. She could not keep down her food. Her strength withered, and her beauty, so celebrated only weeks earlier, seemed to fade before the eyes of courtiers. Each morning, servants whispered new rumors through the gilded corridors. Some said the Tsarina had been bewitched, others that she was cursed by jealous women rejected in the bride show. Many murmured that the gods were punishing Ivan himself for his sins, for the rivers of blood he had spilled during his reign. Whatever the explanation, the sight of a young empress wasting away only days after her marriage struck terror into the superstitious hearts of all. Marfa's decline was relentless. Witnesses wrote that she could hardly stand without support, that her once golden hair dulled and fell out in strands, that her lips turned blue as if her very blood had turned against her. Her eyes, once sparkling with youthful brightness, grew glassy, staring at nothing for long stretches of time. Physicians prescribed warm baths, herbs, charms, and endless prayers. They burned incense against the evil eye. They whispered blessings and crossed themselves feverishly, but none of it stemmed her suffering. Ivan the Terrible raged like a wounded beast. To see his carefully chosen bride collapse into sickness was more than a private tragedy. It was, in his mind, an assault on his very destiny. He had gambled everything on this marriage. His hope for an heir, his dream of restoring stability, even his pride before the nobles who watched his every move. And now, before those same eyes, that gamble seemed cursed. Every hour of Marfa's illness stoked his paranoia. He stormed into her chamber at all hours, demanding answers, demanding progress. When priests assured him that her suffering was God's will, he accused them of cowardice. When doctors explained her weakness as exhaustion, he accused them of lies. He trusted no one, not even those closest to him. The Oprichniki, his dreaded black-clad enforcers, became vultures in the palace. They listened to every whisper, reported every stray comment, and turned suspicion into accusation. Ivan was convinced that Marfa had been poisoned. To him, this was no mere sickness. It was treachery. Someone, somewhere, wanted to rob him of his bride and his future. Marfa's family fell under immediate scrutiny. Her father, Vasily Sobakin, had once basked in the glory of his daughter's royal selection. Now he trembled in fear. His wife's role in administering the so-called fertility potion was not yet widely known, but suspicion hung over the entire Sobakin household like a noose waiting to tighten. As days slipped by, Marfa's condition deteriorated. She could not leave her bed. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was faint and broken. Some said she begged for her mother. Others claimed she asked only for rest. To Ivan, every word sounded like a prophecy of doom. 15 days after the wedding, the inevitable came. On November the 13th, 1571, Marfa Sobakina breathed her last. She was not yet 20 years old. The court was stunned. An empress who had entered the palace in gowns heavy with jewels now departed in silence, her body carried to the cathedral for burial. The bells that had rung so joyously for her wedding now tolled for her funeral. But if the court was shaken, Ivan was shattered. To him, Marfa's death was not the tragic hand of fate. It was murder. He refused to believe that a young, healthy woman could collapse so swiftly unless poisoned by enemies. His grief mutated into fury. He became obsessed with unmasking the culprits, whether real or imagined. The oprichniki, unleashed by their master's paranoia, began their investigations with blood. Accusations flew like arrows in every direction. Boyars were questioned, priests were summoned, healers were dragged into chambers and forced to confess under torture. Some swore they had seen dark powders slipped into food. Others confessed to conspiracies they had never dreamed of, their voices broken by the rack and the whip. Marfa's own family was not spared. Vasily Sobakin, her father, endured endless interrogations. The wealth that had once elevated his family now painted him as a target. In Ivan's twisted logic, perhaps the Sobakins themselves had plotted against him, offering their daughter only to betray him at the altar. It was a charge without evidence, but evidence was no longer needed in the halls of the oprichniki. Suspicion was enough. Everywhere in Moscow, fear spread like a plague. Nobles whispered that no one was safe, not even those closest to the Tsar. The death of a girl, barely crowned empress, had become the spark for another wave of terror. Ivan's grief had sharpened into vengeance, and vengeance, in his hands, meant rivers of blood. The tragedy of Marfa Sobakina was complete. A young woman chosen as the hope of Russia, dead within weeks, her body frail and broken, her name forever tied to one of the most infamous reigns in history. But her death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of Ivan's descent into deeper paranoia, cruelty and violence, a descent that would stain Russia for generations. Marfa Sobakina's death was not only a personal catastrophe for Ivan, it became a turning point in his reign. In the minds of many Russians, the young Tsarina's passing was wrapped in mystery, but in Ivan's mind it was clear. This was treachery, a scandal plotted against him by enemies lurking in the shadows. His grief twisted quickly into wrath. He no longer saw himself as a widower, but as a ruler under siege, surrounded by conspirators who had dared to strike at him through his bride. And when Ivan believed he had been betrayed, mercy was no longer possible. The investigations began with whispers and ended with screams. The oprichniki stormed through Moscow, arresting nobles, merchants, servants, anyone whose name was breathed in suspicion. Torture chambers filled. The accused were stretched on the rack until bones snapped, or thrust into iron cauldrons, or beaten until they confessed. Confessions were seldom more than the cries of agony, but they were enough for Ivan. Among those who suffered were members of Marfa's own family. Her father, Vasily Sobakin, endured the Tsar's rage and humiliation. The family's wealth, once a blessing, now seemed a curse. To Ivan, it was proof that they had both the means and the ambition to conspire. The Sobakins would never fully recover from the suspicion cast upon them, their name forever shadowed by the tragedy. But Ivan's vengeance did not stop with them. He turned his fury against the boyars, the hereditary nobles he had long distrusted. To him, they were snakes coiled in the grass, waiting for the moment to strike. Marfa's death gave him the excuse to cut them down. Prominent families were accused of plots they had never devised. Their estates were seized, their sons executed, their daughters married off to loyalists or cast into exile. Even the clergy felt his wrath. Priests who had presided over Marfa's wedding found, themselves interrogated. Ivan demanded to know why their blessings had failed, why their prayers had not protected his bride. Some were beaten, others exiled, their failure treated as evidence of complicity. The church, which should have been a sanctuary, trembled under his suspicion. As executions multiplied, the people of Moscow began to speak of the scandal in hushed tones. They did not dare name poison or plot aloud, for fear that the oprichniki would appear at their doors. Instead, they muttered of curses, of divine punishment, of the wrath of God upon a Tsar who had spilled too much blood. Whether it was poison or providence, none could deny that Marfa's death had unleashed another storm of terror. For Ivan himself, the loss cut deeper than the public could see. Those closest to him said he spoke often of Marfa in the weeks that followed, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with rage. At moments he raged that she had been taken by enemies, at others he wept that God had forsaken him. The instability of his emotions mirrored the instability of his reign, one moment caressing the memory of his bride, the next moment ordering more executions to avenge her. Marfa's short life and shorter reign became a symbol of fragility in Ivan's Russia. She had been chosen from among thousands, crowned in silks and pearls, and buried before she could ever know the full weight of her title. Her name was added to the long list of tragedies surrounding Ivan. Wives dead in their youth, children buried before their fathers, families destroyed in waves of suspicion. Historians still debate the truth of her death. Was it truly mercury poisoning from her mother's well-meaning potion? Was it a hidden hand in the court, a rival clan seeking to undermine Ivan through his bride? Or was it simple misfortune, the cruel randomness of disease in a time before modern medicine? We will likely never know with certainty, but to Ivan the answer did not matter. He had already chosen his truth. Marfa's death was a scandal, an assassination cloaked in sickness, and he would punish it with fire and steel. Her passing deepened his descent into paranoia and cruelty. In the years that followed, Ivan grew even more ruthless. He murdered his own heir in a fit of rage. He destroyed entire cities in waves of retribution, and all the while, the memory of Marfa's wasted figure lingered in the background, another wound that never healed, another ghost in the haunted corridors of his palace. Thus, the tale of Marfa Sobakina is not only the story of a young bride poisoned by fate or folly. It is also the story of how grief can twist into tyranny, how love can collapse into vengeance, and how the scandal of a single death could ripple outward to shape the fate of an empire. Her crown was heavy, her reign fleeting, her death mysterious. And yet her shadow stretches across history, bound forever to the man known as Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar whose heart could not protect the woman he loved, but whose fury could destroy the nation he ruled.